Welcome back to the Transport Topics magazine event series, Recharge, and a very special episode of RoadSigns, the podcast series from Transport Topics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the future of trucking. During this series, we've been talking about the evolution of EVs and EV maintenance. We've talked to OEMs, and we've also discussed matters about the recharging infrastructure. But there's a lot going on inside the electric vehicle space, definitely under the hood. So for this episode, we're going to ask, what exactly is under the EV hood? For that answer, we have two guests who are well versed in that category. We're going to talk to Steve Solinsky from Dana Incorporated about the e-components that are under the hood of an electric vehicle later in the program. But first, we're going to talk about battery maintenance. And for that, we have CEO of Acertus, an automotive transport solutions firm, CEO Trent Broberg. Welcome to the show, Trent.
Mike, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you on. You know, you're in the business of moving cars, and definitely you are well aware of the trend of EVs as it's coming on strong, definitely in the passenger market that you've been a big part of. But in this space, the commercial trucking space, there's an anticipation for the incoming of EVs, and not just for the OEMs that these fleets are ordering from, but also the battery maintenance that's involved. And with batteries, that's sort of the heart and nervous system of the EVs, similar to the internal combustion engine, the ICE of the diesel, and just from in your space, and just in getting to know that battery maintenance space, especially when it comes to EVs, can you just describe for us just the importance of that?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Michael. The EVs create a lot of challenges a lot of opportunities and challenges when it comes to not just maintenance, but the infrastructure to support the maintenance, the roadworthiness of the vehicles, the weight of the vehicles. We could go down a lot of different conversations here, but the one thing to keep mind of when you're thinking battery maintenance, it's much like your iPhone. It's much like any other battery out there. You don't want to charge it to 100% all the time, and you don't want it to go down to zero all the time. So you've got this sweet spot that you'll see 20% to 80% that you want to keep that battery from a maintenance perspective. That creates additional challenges. It does reduce travel transit times and does take some time to get charged. But that's a sweet spot right now from an EV perspective.
From that beginning explanation, just kind of akin to the cell phone that you're just referring to, is it that type of mindset that technicians should have when entering into battery maintenance? Because there's some people listening right now who are small and mid-sized fleets who are just curious about this world of EVs that are coming. So when they do have that EV vehicle, of course you're going to have to worry about the maintenance. Is that the type of mind shift that technicians should have, just in the sense of that battery being like a cell phone?
Yeah, it's a completely different propulsion system, right? So when you think about the ICE vehicles that have been around for a century, there's a lot of advantages because of the infrastructure built up around that, the knowledge, the technology, the parts for parts and service. When you think about the distribution of those parts and services, and when things break, you need to fix them quickly. So there's a myriad of supply chain challenges that will also come alongside and ride alongside the EV adoption rate. But yeah, I think if you're an engineer and you're a shop, you're a fleet, you need to be thinking about. You mentioned the term they're curious, and I think that's the general gist of the industry, is this general curiosity, because the reality is, you have less than 1% of commercial trucks out there on the road that are EV. And from a sales perspective and forecasting, will still persist that low level going forward. Obviously, light duty will adopt and has adopted first, and that will push into the Class 8.
Yeah, yeah. To that particular point, there's fleets like UPS and other large size fleets who have gone into the EV realm, but in metro cities, on that last mile segment, in Houston and Atlanta, to name a few cities. So just easing into that process. So the lighter, I mean the smaller fleets and those mid fleets is that the EV space. I mean that would be something that would be at least economically viable, wouldn't it be, for them to enter in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different things to think about when you're a fleet owner. It's obviously length of haul. That's your biggest challenge. The time to charge, your infrastructure associated to that. So the way that we support a lot of these light duty vehicles throughout our facilities are those final mile type delivery components. They're the bread boxes of the light duty vehicles. Less so on the Class 8s right now. There's a few big commercial fleets that are. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and it seems to be a hotbed for trials and testing because it's flat when you're driving between here and LA. And there are some, AB InBev and Pepsi and many others that are testing in a short range capacity. But the biggest challenge is you got to charge them. So you can't run these. You can't do a drop and hook scenario. So you've got to charge these because they can't run, as much as obviously a nice vehicle can.
Yes, I mean that's sort of the disadvantage in that regard. But however, let's get into the nitty gritty of it, just in battery performance and having that EV. Let's say I'm a small fleet midsize owner. I got an army of EVs ready to go, and I've been rolling them for a while now, and it's time to do some maintenance. What are some of the things? What are some of the initial things that a fleet owner needs to be aware of when he has or she has those fleets of EVs for a few months now? What were those considerations?
Well, generally speaking, an EV is less maintenance because it doesn't have as many moving parts. So that's a positive. When you think about, right now it's really going through this innovation cycle. So there's a lot of break fixes in a lot of EVs out there that are just trial and error, right? You're
Hmm.
building the plane while you're flying it, so to speak. So the adaptability and once again, it's the service infrastructure that's challenged here. It's you've
Hmm.
got to send typically technicians out versus having a third party come to the truck on the roadside to fix something. So you've got to get a network here that can support these. You've got to get physical infrastructure. You might have a couple of different DCs, hubs, fleet shops, but you've got to get partnerships probably outside of that can service you if you're functioning as a hub and spoke model. So really, it's a little more broad based, and you've got to send the technicians in many times. It depends on the situation here, because keeping in mind the majority of the challenges that are on the road when you think about break fixes are trailer doors and lights and tires and brakes, and those are all the same,
Hmm.
right? So you really service them the same way you otherwise would. So hopefully in the long run, this will actually reduce service costs and increase the depreciation or longevity of these vehicles on the road.
Okay. You had mentioned the challenges to that supply chain of the infrastructure, of building the infrastructure, and that's just one of the main concerns of EVs altogether. What are some of those particular pain points that are such a struggle?
Well, the first and foremost is simply just the charging infrastructure needed here. If you're talking about a vehicle, some of these new Class 8 trucks have batteries that weigh as much as 10 Model S Plaid batteries. So you're talking a huge capacity for charging need
Hmm.
from a kilowatt hour perspective, and that's your biggest challenge. So once again, it's being able to charge them quickly, charge them from an infrastructure that makes sense for you because they're obviously down and they're not moving when they're charging. What's interesting to me is, a lot of these OEMs, and there's plenty of OEMs, whether it's PACCAR and many others that are coming out right now with, well, I think PACCAR's got 7 different EVs on the road. So there's a lot of testing. The infrastructure will follow with the infrastructure bills passed by the administration, but it's going to take some time. The adoption and the demand for EVs will outpace the infrastructure for years.
So, I mean, that sounds like a situation of the chicken and egg or horse and cart, however you want to put that,
Yeah.
because I mean, as you probably well aware, states such as California, I think New York, I believe, by 2035, want to have all vehicles that are sold. I mean, at least in the passenger realm, electric by that particular time. Now, and as you were just mentioning with the infrastructure and there's just a race to build that particular network. I mean, what will kind of come first? Will that network be there by 2035?
Your guess is as good as mine. You could probably ask anybody on the street, and then it's a little bit cloudy on that environment. But I think it's going to be challenged. It's going to be challenged for many years to come because as these vehicles start rolling, even on the passenger side EVs, if you look at California, 40% of all EVs sold in 2022 were in California.
Hmm.
So the obvious adoption rates are through the roof there. Obviously, the charging infrastructure will continue to grow and demand. But from a commercial perspective, the need to charge these vehicles is, like I said, 10x what it would be a passenger vehicle. And you can't run at night. So if your charging needs, depending on how fast you can charge these vehicles, it's going to be a big challenge. And you might need to increase the size of your fleet to to manage that charging time where you otherwise could just uh, fuel up at any gas station across America or any diesel and keep moving.
That's a very good point. I mean, there was just a report in Bloomberg about just on the passenger realm with some are figuring New York to be a desert when it comes to EV charging infrastructure. But we're here to talk about commercial
Yeah.
vehicles, and as you said, that demand is going to be 10 times. So for that small fleet, mid-sized fleet owner who has those electric vehicles and is under that pressure of that 10 times of needed service. What are some of the things they can do to boost production for that battery? I mean, in case of there's not a place to recharge.
It's working with the shippers, right? So you're from an asset perspective, it's creating the right legs and the right network optimization in the shippers because I believe that a lot of these shippers will adopt infrastructure and it's already happening today for charging capabilities and it's working with that shipper to be able to charge. Think about the detention time in a parking facility or the unload and load times. Those can all be opportunities for charging in theory, right? In a not
Mhm.
necessarily drop and hook scenario, but those types of things. There is a lot of latent time. I think the average truck is still using 7.5 hours per logbook per day, which is the same, maybe seven, maybe a little bit increase as it was 20 years ago when I started in logistics. So there's a lot of downtime at shippers because of the industrial component of that loading and unloading. So how can we utilize that for EVs? And small and mid fleets are really just trying to understand likely what their network can support because these trucks out there they still have a usable distance of less than 500 and that's a max capacity. So you really want it much less than that.
Okay. Well, what's some of the feedback that you've heard from the clients you work with, concerning EVs who have exposure with EVs in that commercial space? I mean, what are some of the experiences that they're telling you?
Well, it's great. The drivers love them. The drivers, the drivers, it's got a lot of torque. So when you're talking about, grades, steep grades and things like that, they're great vehicles. They're also all new vehicles. So you get the advantage of all the other technology associated to that, whether it's safe driving technology and otherwise. So the drivers love it. The drivers are a precious resource, obviously, out there. It's a challenged environment to support drivers. So I think that will obviously drive some of the adoption of these fleets because it's it seems to be the drivers that I've talked to that drive EV trucks, whether they be light or heavy duty, just love them. I think that's the first and foremost, and I think that will drive adoption. But it's in theory, diesel prices are not cheap right now, so having to pay for electricity is a little bit cheaper, especially from a commercial perspective.
Oh,
So there's
yes.
some financial benefits there.
Yeah, definitely. But speaking of just about the energy, for anyone who's wanting to get into into the recharging infrastructure side, the recharging side of that infrastructure, there definitely has to be. You were talking about working with shippers, but I would definitely think that those who want to be in that charging space will have to speak with their energy providers as well, and that's another whole bag of worms for fleets
Hmm.
and others and other shareholders to undertake. So, I mean, and with that, I mean that conversation is pretty important too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of federal grants out there with the new
Mhm.
infrastructure bill. We're upfitting a lot of our facilities. We've got somewhere around 57 facilities across the U.S. that we're upfitting for EV charging capabilities.
Mhm.
um, and be thinking about, how there are a lot of companies out there that are upfitting or retrofitting local infrastructure or increasing that. You've got to understand what the site can support. So as you look at new facilities, it should be a checkbox to understand, what the capacity is in that facility. But work with your local jurisdiction, your local municipalities, because there's a lot of state and federal tax credits out there that can really support this growth and adoption at the onset of this curve.
Okay. Well, Trent, one last question before we get you out of here. And
Yeah.
first of all, thank you for coming on to our event series and Road Science podcast. Uh, the expression, well, the analogy that you used earlier in our conversation about the cell phone, that's a very interesting one, in the sense that with ice vehicles, when it's time to get gas, you go to a gas station, you get gas. Now, and with electric vehicle, it's not. I mean, it's simple, but it's not that simple in the parallels that I just described earlier. And for those in that recharging space or wanting to get in that recharging space, like the truck stops, you had mentioned the
Yeah.
warehouses, and even the fleets that want to power their own EVs. I'm going to ask you to put your analyst hat on, Trent, and just make a sort of a bold prediction. Where do you see that in the next 5 to 10 years? Who's going to have that particular market space when it comes to the recharging? So, I guess my question, when a truck driver in the year 2035 is going down the road, where is he or she going to get that charge from?
Great question. So obviously in your home base, so that's first and foremost, whether you have a slip seat operation or simply a dedicated situation. So obviously at the home base, the shipper, and then when you think about that middle mile, the more near term or long term, truck stops, because that's going to be where all the other facilities are that you're already used to. So as you think about this adoption curve, the number of pumps at truck stop have to convert to the number of EV charging at the same rate, depending on the lane, that EVs will. EVs don't act as well in really cold climates, for example, because the battery can't hold a charge as long, or you can't charge it as much. So as you think about, I mentioned that Phoenix to LA route,
Hmm.
you're going to see infrastructure pop up there a lot sooner than it would up in Minnesota, for example, just because there's going to be more demand for it. So demand will drive the investments from a lot of these truck stops, and then obviously the infrastructure at home base.
Well, it's definitely going to be a long game, but it's going to be very
That's
entertaining
right.
from where we sit to look at it. We've been speaking with Trent Broberg, CEO of Acertus. Trent, it's been a pleasure having you on to the event series and the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.